Ladies and gentlemen, the presentation of course by our captain of our current team in Josh Fraser. But it's fantastic. One of the great things you have as president of the football club is to ring people on the day that they're drafted to the club. It's a great thrill for me to tell people they've been made a life member of the club, and to tell families or players concerned that they've been elevated to the Hall of Fame. And this family is no different. It's interesting when you look back, and as we saw there, that Flapper Hughes played in the early part of last century. Yet his family is so proud of the achievements of their great-grandfather and their grandfather. All the memorabilia at the back of the room, and I encourage everybody to have a bit of a look at it later on, is still housed in the houses of these people here tonight who are so proud. They're black and white to their bootstraps, they love their football club, and they've had over 100 years of service to the club as not only one of the greatest players, but also as great supporters. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Flapper Hughes and his family.
Thank you very much, everybody, every Collingwood supporter, every sponsor and everything else. I'd just like to, I didn't think this day would ever come, I must admit. I'd spoken to Eddie about 4.5 years ago. I had the privilege of meeting him at Leicester Centre. It was a little bit high in the sky, but there's a lot of people that have jumped in to do it, particularly my second cousin, Russell, who's worked his bum off trying to do things. Les was a great character. I lost my mother when I was 5 years of age. Les was my hero. Spent his time, brought Billy Sarong into the Collingwood Football Club because he was best mates with Billy's father. A whole lot of history. I used to go to Collingwood when I was a 6 and 7 year old on my own and stood behind the goals, the Victoria Park end. Never had any drama with anybody because we're all true and blue Collingwood supporters, and that's the way it's all about. Look after one another, do everything. I'd like to thank a couple of people. I'd like to thank Desi Luckman, who I had an operation 2 years ago on my heart. Desi was in the bed next to me. I told him this story about my grandfather and he didn't believe me. But 2 weeks later he rang me up and said, "You've probably got something there, son." I'd like to thank Kevin Rose for all the effort that he's put in to make sure that this happened. And I've never met Kevin officially before, even though I was involved in VFA football. Billy Sarong, but particularly I'd like to thank the Collingwood Football Club to take on that era of a player that most people were talking about the turn of the previous century. Most clubs, probably all clubs, apart from Collingwood, will tend to forget the people that actually developed the roots of what the whole club's about. And I thank all of you for being here to celebrate this occasion with us. It's fantastic, much appreciated.
I'd also like to support Alan's comments by thanking Eddie and the Collingwood Football Club. I think it's fantastic that they actually do have these events and acknowledge past players. It's been a great thrill for the family. I'd also like to thank Kevin Rose and the committee for the Hall of Fame. One thing I'd like to just say is that collection up the back was given to me as a sort of a teenager by my grandmother Les's daughter, one of the 2 daughters. And again, my grandmother paid for the framing of it when I married my wife Sue, and we had a room at the house dedicated to Les Hughes. Nothing gave me greater pleasure than watching my grandmother reminisce in that room in the latter parts of her life and talk about stories about how she would hang around Les's ankles after a game, waiting for John Wren to hand out his envelopes. And she knew that if an envelope came, that she was in for a treat that night. So the other story I'd like to emphasise, and this is quite an important one as far as the significance of Les within the history of the game, is and Eddie realises this too when he spoke to me on the phone originally, was that Les is instrumental in an incident which started the Collingwood-Carlton rivalry back in 1910 at the grand final. And before 1910, both Collingwood and Carlton were very good friends, and in fact Carlton sponsored Collingwood into the league from the VFA into the VFL. And they used to go on Christmas trips together and removal vans and picnics in the bush, and they used to go into each other's change room after the game. They're very chummy. But that was to be no more after Les Hughes was decked prior to the bounce at the start of the 1910 grand final. He was also decked again at the start of the third quarter, managed to get into the best players, and we won the grand final. So I was telling Eddie this story on the phone, and Eddie said, you don't have to tell me about these pricks, I know this story back and front. And so I think if there's any legacy, it's Les's contribution to the Collingwood Carlton rivalry, and I thank the Collingwood Football Club again. Thank you very much.
Collingwood has known a few gentle giants in its time, but none have been held in greater affection than Les Hughes. In a career spanning 15 years, 225 games, and no less than 3 premierships, he won a reputation as a big game player, as a champion ruckman, and as one of the greatest characters the game has seen. Les Hughes arrived at Victoria Park in 1908 from the Collingwood Trades team in the Wednesday League. He was unusually tall for his time, standing 6'2" with long arms and a raw, ungainly, almost uncoordinated manner that quickly earned him the nickname Flapper. By 1911, he was the best tap ruckman in the league, a tireless worker with exceptional stamina who jogged tirelessly from start to finish and always performed in finals. The football record stated that he seems to have eyes all over his head and he smacks the ball in whatever direction he sees a cobber ready to receive it. But it was as much for his personality as for his famous on-field performances that Les Hughes won godlike status with the Collingwood fans. The Herald wrote of him, "Next to Dick Lee, no man in the famous Magpie combination of these past seasons has been held in higher esteem by the crowd than Flapper Hughes. His place has always been where the battle raged thickest, and he has not once lost his temper." Les Hughes played his last game in 1922 at the age of 38. He had represented and captained Victoria many times. He had become a true legend of the game. Collingwood has had no greater tap ruckman and no greater character. Tonight, we celebrate his wonderful career with his induction into the Collingwood Hall of Fame.